When we think about the metals a coin can be made out of, most people think about gold, silver, and bronze, or copper, or any copper alloy. And that's a fairly reasonable assumption. Historically, these were the metals that were mainly used in the manufacture of coins, and numismatists are very well used to them and their little peculiarities. We even have an abbreviated way of referring to them: AV or AU, AR, and AE. These are their abbreviated names in Latin: aureus, argentum, and AES. However, when you become a collector and you start diving into the world of numismatics, a few other metals will appear quite often. One of them is Billon. Let's explore this unique metal today. And this week's episode is kindly sponsored by L5, the new online marketplace for ancient coins. L5 is a platform that focuses on trust, transparency, and low fees. It is an environment where you can safely buy coins to add to your collection, knowing every item listed has been vetted by specialists, with a lifetime guarantee of authenticity, and the new system of online bidding that ensures fair, transparent bidding. No sniping, no shield bids, just a fair trading environment for buyers and sellers. L5's proposal is to eliminate all uncertainties beginners and experienced collectors alike might have when buying a coin, while offering a low-cost service with no listing fees and a buyer's premium of just 5%. Make sure to check out L5.com for what I believe is a new platform that the ancient coin market was in need for. Now, Billon is a bit of a tricky word. Let's not mix it up with a couple of other similar words with totally different meanings. There's the word billion, which is a number, so a 1 followed by 9 zeros, and there's bullion, which is a piece of refined precious metal without necessarily being a coin. The term refers to the refined precious metal itself. The word billon comes from Old French, and it means something like a log, an ingot, a lump. It's a reference to the ingots of this metal that were made prior to them being shaped and struck into coins. This name, meant to represent the artificially made piece of alloyed metal, makes perfect sense because Billon isn't naturally occurring. It's a man-made alloy of silver and copper, or silver and other base metals. However, copper is by far the most common one. Here on your screen, there's an example of a Billon coin. This is a tetradrachma, struck in Egypt when it was part of the Roman Empire. This particular coin was struck in the 2nd century AD, during the reign of Antoninus Pius, and you can see it has silver in its composition. It has a distinct silvery appearance. However, it clearly doesn't look as bright and pristine as pure silver, because it's a mix of metals. When I first saw a Billon coin, 2 questions immediately came to my head. First, why? What's the point of mixing copper and silver in a coin? Just make pure silver coins, pure copper coins, and build a monetary system based on high value, pure silver coins, and small change made out of pure copper, and that's it. These coins would be easier to make, there would be less steps in the manufacture, it's easier to check the quality of the metal in these coins. After all, there's supposed to be only one metal in there, and as a result, it would be easier to assess their value. Billon as a coin metal, at first glance, doesn't make sense. The other question I had was one of terminology. If we start with a pure silver coin and we start adding copper to its alloy, when do we stop calling it silver and start calling it Billon? And as it becomes mostly copper, when it's 5, 3, 1% silver, when do we stop calling it Billon and just call it bronze or copper? The answer is actually surprisingly complicated. Let me address the question of terminology first, as it's quicker. By definition, Billon is an alloy of silver and some sort of base metal, in which the proportion of silver is less than 50%, going down to as low as any intentional quantity of silver was added to the alloy, which is generally considered 1% for pre-industrial metallurgy. However, The answer isn't that clear-cut, and there isn't a universal standard for when a coin stops being called silver and starts being called Billon. It's generally a matter of the appearance of the coin, and it can vary from person to person. As an example, here is an Antoninianus of Emperor Gordian III. Despite its very pretty, silvery appearance, these coins only contain 40% silver in them. Most people call these coins silver. You will see them being sold as AR, Argentum, silver on dealers' listings. But if we want to be technical about it, they should be called Billon, but almost nobody does it. That's because the silver doesn't mix very well with copper, which makes up the other 60% of this coin. And silver also has the tendency of, how may I put it, impose its color much more than other metals. An alloy that contains some silver in it only starts becoming dark and dull when the silver quantity starts dropping below 30-20%. There were also plenty of techniques used by the Romans and throughout the Middle Ages that improved the appearance of the surface of these coins, making them look like pure silver, even if they were not. Here's an example of these metallurgy tricks. Check out this Antoninianus of Emperor Valerian. It looks spectacular. It even developed a golden toning on its surface that makes it look like it has gold in its alloy. This coin only has around 25% silver in it. However, as you can see, the surface enrichment technique that was applied to its surface makes it look like it's pure silver. It was actually listed by the dealer as silver. However, it isn't. That's Billon. It was not a case of dishonesty on the seller's part. It's just that, like I mentioned, different people have different perspectives as to what constitutes Billon. However, as these coins circulated for a little bit and that artificially enriched top layer got worn off, like in this other example of Valerian you have now on your screen, we see the real nature of the coin, the real color of Billon, which is this darker, dull tone of silver, tainted by the copper mixed in its composition. As the silver fineness in the alloy goes lower and lower, it becomes darker and darker, eventually starting to assume that reddish brown color of copper as the percentage of silver drops under 10%. So, how low does Billon go? How little silver should we add to a coin that we can't consider it to be Billon anymore, but rather bronze or copper with traces of silver in it? To explain that, I'm going to paradoxically use a coin of very high silver quality as an example. Roman Republican denarii like this one we have on screen now were supposed to be pure silver, as pure as the Romans could achieve. 95-96%, pretty good. The rest of the alloy was made out of trace elements: copper, tin, lead, other metals that couldn't be removed with traditional refining techniques, or metals that ended up in the alloy as contaminants from the mint environment. Gold, for example, is a common trace element on silver coins, with most ancient coins containing between 0.3 and 0.5% gold in them. This gold was not added there intentionally. So generally, a quantity of metal in an alloy to be considered intentional, it has to be above a concentration of 1%. Coins like this Antoninianus of Claudius Gothicus have some of the lowest intentional amounts of silver added to its alloy, around 2%. We know that even this pathetic amount of silver was intentional, and it gave these coins some intrinsic value in the eyes of the Romans who used it as money. There was even a thin silver wash added to these coins to show people that they did have some precious metal in them. Otherwise, the mint wouldn't have bothered to improve the coin's appearance. Later coins like this one, Centenionalis of Constantine I, also have a very small silver content, 1.5% in this case. And we know this tiny silver content was, once again, intentional, and it was measured and added to the alloy. And actually, merchants did pay attention to the little silver the Imperial Mint added to these pieces because they constantly checked coins to see if they weren't being scammed by the mint. In this case, when you're shopping for these coins with very low silver content, you might encounter the opposite situation. Dealers might advertise these coins as AE, bronze coins. At first glance, it makes sense, especially when these coins have lost their silver plating. They look like pure copper. But once again, if we want to be technical about it, they are Billon. There is intentional silver in the alloy. At the end of the day, all that I'm saying here are technicalities, really. And in practical terms, it's up to you to consider if a coin is silver, Billon, or bronze. But at least now you know why they might be classified differently. Now, on the subject of why bother making a bimetallic coin out of a silver and copper mix, with all of the disadvantages that it had? And probably the main one was that there was a huge issue of mistrust with these coins. Silver was always much more valuable than copper, so the fact the coin was made out of a mix of two metals with very different values and no way to quickly measure the proportions of each metal in the coin generated a huge trust issue with the public. Just make coins out of pure copper and pure silver so everyone knows what they're dealing with. As far as my research got me, there were three main reasons to make Billon coins. The first one, which is the less common but it's probably the coolest one, is that Billon coins were issued as part of a monetary system that was entirely made out of bimetallic coins. You see, in the very early history of coinage, coins were bimetallic. The first coins ever to be made were struck at the Kingdom of Lydia on modern-day Western Turkey. We're talking about the mid-7th century, early 6th century BC. These coins were made out of electrum, a mix of gold and silver. And soon after its invention, the concept of coins and this alloy started to spread around the area, reaching the Greek cities closest to Lydia in less than a century. One of these early adopters of coins was the island of Lesbos. In the late Archaic and early Classical period, we're talking about the 500s, 450s BC, the city-states on this island seem to have entered into a monetary union, issuing electrum coins for high-value transactions and foreign trade, and a series of Billon coins for internal commerce and smaller transactions. These Billon coins had an average proportion of 40% silver and 60% copper on average. It's actually fascinating. The idea of coins was so new at this time that the only reference they had of this new technology, coins, were bimetallic pieces because these were the first coins that were invented. They were bimetallic. The concept of making coins out of a single metal would only be introduced over 100 years after the invention of the first coins, and for a time, making them out of two metals was the norm. I've brought you a couple of cool examples. Here is a diobol from between 500 and 450 BC. This coin was most likely issued at Mytilene, the largest city on Lesbos. At first glance, we can see this coin is not made out of pure silver. It has a much darker color to it. Some of it is due to the natural toning on the coin's surface, but even when it was brand new, these coins were not as shiny as pure silver coins. One of the main symbols of the city was the confronted head of two boars or two bulls. The animals changed depending on the coin issue. In this case, we have two boars bumping heads. Notice the lumpy, almost round appearance of the coin. This is one of the main visual features of very early archaic coins. The idea of coins being on the shape of a disc had not been developed yet, so most early coins look more like a little ball. On the reverse, we have an ink sponge, another feature of these early coins. It was meant to show that the coin was made out of solid metal all the way to its core, instead of it being a plated forgery. This wasn't very effective, however. There are quite a few plated counterfeits from the period that have this ink sponge, so the idea was abandoned during the later classical period, in favor of designs on both sides. I think this reverse, with its dark surfaces and brownish color, makes it super clear that this coin had a high copper content in it. Here's another example from around 480 to 450 BC. This time this is an obol, so half the weight of the previous coin. This is the kind of piece you would use on the marketplaces to buy everyday items like food. As you can see, it is quite worn, which goes in line with the idea that these Billon coins were used for internal trade and low-value transactions, so they certainly circulated a whole lot more than the expensive Electrum coins. And look how curious. We have the image of a person on the obverse, and this person clearly has some African facial features. This must be a more generic portrait rather than something trying to represent a particular individual, because we can see some exaggerated features such as the lips, a broad nose, and a very curly hair. I really like this portrait. It illustrates that maybe the ancient world must have been more interconnected than we imagine. We know from historical sources that the Mediterranean peoples had plenty of contact with Africans, not only from northern Africa, but also with people from regions deeper down in the continent. Greek texts mention black merchants conducting trade in Greek markets, mentions of Ethiopians and Nubians, not only tradesmen but also mercenaries in Greek armies. They would have been a minority, of course, however, they must have been common enough of a sight in Lesbos for a dye engraver to pay attention to them and decide that they were an interesting model for the portrait on one of their coins. How cool! As for the reverse of this piece, it's rather unremarkable. We once more have an ink sponge, in this case divided into 4 separate sections, and here's another example of the time, but this time it has the same obverse, so I'm going to skip it. However, this one has a slightly more interesting reverse. It still has the square border, like the previous one, but instead of it just being a punch, we now have a simple design on it. An elongated form, looks like an eye or some sort of cereal grain, and a small pellet. It's actually an interesting example of a transitional reverse, with visual features from the archaic square punches, but now it has a separate design for the reverse. Alright, the second reason why Billon coins were made, this is the most common reason. It's that Billon coins were actually debased versions of coins that were originally meant to be pure silver. If you're not familiar with the term debasement, it is the replacement of precious metal in a coin's alloy for another type of cheaper metal, while maintaining the facial value of the coin. Basically, monetary fraud on the part of the king or emperor in order to issue more coins, produce more money with less available precious metal. This was a very common practice all over the world, all throughout history. And it is basically one of the expected outcomes of the state having the monopoly on the issue of money. The temptation of making money out of nothing and not being held responsible for it. After all, you were the one who dispensed justice, was just too great. The opportunity of profit was just too enormous. Most monetary systems follow this path. They generally begin with a quote-unquote healthy set of denominations, coins of consistent weight, and a widely known metal purity on each coin, and as the state has a period of crisis, like maybe a major war or an irresponsible ruler comes to power, coins slowly start to lose weight or the percentage of precious metal in them, and it starts to fall until the system eventually collapses and needs a brand new system. It needs a new system to be created. Here we have an example of a coin issued in a period of crisis and issued under an irresponsible ruler. This is a tetradrachma made under Roman Emperor Elagabalus between 218 and 222 AD. This coin was produced in the Roman Far East. We don't know if it was made in Antioch, Laodicea. It might have been produced at different mints because this issue of coins is very common. Elagabalus had to pay war reparations to Rome's neighbors to the east, the Parthians, which might explain why the Eastern tetradrachma collapses in silver content during his reign, from around 32% in his early reign to just 20% in his last issues. Just by looking at this coin, we can see that the mint workers were having a really tough time doing that surface treatment technique on the coins. The silver content was getting so low that the smallest amount of circulation resulted on a coin like this one we have here, with this weird dark gray color. Even the natural shine of silver is spotty in this coin, as areas with higher concentration of copper show a darker color. Billon allowed the state to conduct this kind of fraud more easily. It was hard to detect the slow but steady decline of the silver in the alloy. By the time merchants and workers realized the coins they were being paid with were worth less and they adjusted their prices accordingly, the state had already paid for the expenses they needed and they already scammed everyone. Billon was the perfect metal to commit monetary fraud. And finally, the third reason to make coins out of Billon was a matter of practicality and a lack of available silver. Most of us haven't seen precious metals in our circulating money. We live in a world of token currency, of money which is entirely fiduciary, meaning our physical cash doesn't have any intrinsic value in it. However, for a state to be able to enforce such a level of forced trust in its money, for it to have no intrinsic value, it requires a very stable government with a tight grip on its population. In the times we currently live in, our governments have a level of control or at least awareness of how we conduct our lives that would make any absolutist medieval monarch very envious. Ancient or medieval states, however, had a much weaker grip on its citizens, a lower level of control over them and over what they chose to conduct trade with, and it was much harder to enforce the use of their money. They had to add a certain level of intrinsic value to coins in order to stimulate people to attribute value to the coins and to actually use them. This generated the demand for precious metals, and sometimes there just wasn't a lot of it available. This was particularly noticeable in Europe during the early and high Middle Ages. A coin made out of pure silver, even a small one weighing just 1 gram, was a lot of money, quite impractical for everyday use. That's why many kingdoms produced coins made out of Billon, with small percentages of silver in them. This allowed the production of coins with more modest value, and these were something that was actually usable in everyday trade and in larger transactions. You just had to use more of them. Here we have an example of such coins. This is a dinheiro, struck in Portugal during the reign of Diniz I in the late 13th century. Very humble coin. Portugal was a poor, peripheral kingdom at this time. This was before Portugal became the maritime empire it would become. It only has around 8.5% silver in its alloy, a very low value coin even for the impoverished standards of medieval Europe. However, such coins were more versatile. For a time, this was the only denomination struck in the kingdom, so a low value coin allowed for more transactions to be conducted with money, reducing the need for barter, monetizing more of the economy, and of course, this allowed the king to tax a larger portion of the population. It is also worthy to mention some very unusual uses of Billon during World War II. The United States 5-cent coin, also called the nickel, had its name due to its composition, 75% copper, 25% nickel. However, between 1942 and 1945, the country's supply of nickel had to be diverted to the war effort. Nickels were temporarily made out of 56% copper, 35% silver, and 9% manganese. Technically, these coins were Billon. There were also many different instances of Billon coins issued during the early to mid-20th century throughout the world, as the planet abandoned any gold-backed systems and we entered our era of fiduciary money. Sweden issued a 5 kroner coin made out of 40% silver, so technically Billon, up to 1971, and the coin is still legal tender. Alright, so now you know a little bit more about this very unique monetary alloy. Now I want to hear from you, collectors. Do you have a coin made out of Billon in your collection? Let us know in the comment section down below. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you did. Happy collecting, and I'll see you soon. Let me give a special thank you to all of my amazing channel members and Patreons for their generous support. This channel would not be the same without your help. And if you would like to be part of this list, have early access to my videos when they are uploaded to YouTube, and a series of other perks, make sure to check out my Patreon page and my members tab on YouTube. Thank you very much. And we have a new Tier 4 member. Thank you very much, Giga, for your, well, Giga support to the channel. And if you too want to enjoy the exclusive perks that Giga will have access to, consider checking out my Patreon and joining us.